Marcus watched through his kitchen window as orange flames devoured 40 years of his life, his prize-winning quarter horses screaming in terror, his grandfather's hand-built barn collapsing into ash and ember. The insurance investigators, words still echoed in his ears. Definitely arson, Mr. Chen, someone wanted to hurt you bad. But as Marcus stared at his neighbor's pristine, backyard pool glittering under the moonlight, the same neighbor who'd threatened him just days before, a cold smile spread across his weathered face. Tomorrow, 10 cement trucks would roll down Maple Street, and justice would be served 1 ton at a time. The sirens cut through Marcus Chen's dreams at 3:47 a.m., their wailing crescendo dragging him from sleep with the urgency of disaster. He bolted. Upright in bed, his wife Sarah, already throwing back covers, both of them moving with a practiced efficiency of people who'd lived on a ranch for 23 years and knew that middle-of-the-night emergencies rarely brought good news. "The barn," Sarah whispered, her voice catching as she pressed her face to the bedroom window. "Oh God, Marcus, the barn's on fire." Marcus was already pulling on his jeans, his calloused hands shaking as he struggled with the zipper. The window, he could see the skeletal frame of his grandfather's barn silhouetted against a backdrop of angry orange flames that licked at the star-filled Colorado sky. The structure that had stood for 87 years, weathering blizzards and tornadoes, was being consumed by an inferno that seemed to mock its legacy with every crackling breath. He burst through the front door and sprinted across the frost pasture, his bare feet slipping on the wet grass as he ran toward the nightmare unfolding before him. The horses were screaming high-pitched, desperate sounds that cut through his soul like broken glass. Thunder, his prize-winning quarter-horse stallion, was rearing against his stall door, his eyes rolling white with terror as smoke poured through the gaps in the old wooden boards. "Easy, boy, easy." Marcus shouted over the roar of flames, fumbling with the stall latch as heat pressed against his face like an open oven. The metal was already hot to the touch, but he forced himself to work the mechanism, his fingers burning as he freed Thunder and slapped the horse's flank to send him galloping toward the safety of the far pasture. One by one, he pulled the animals from their stalls: Thunder, Midnight, Buttercup, and finally his daughter's gentle mare, Whisper, for horses saved from what could have been a massacre. But as he stumbled backward, coughing from the smoke that filled his lungs with each labored breath, he realized with crushing certainty that he was too late to save anything else. The fire department arrived as the roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks high into the night sky like angry fireflies seeking revenge. Chief Patterson, a man Marcus had known since high school, approached with the grim expression of someone delivering bad news to an old friend. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Chief Patterson said, pulling off his helmet to reveal sweat-dampened gray hair. "By the time we got here, it was already too far gone. All we can do now is make sure it doesn't spread to your house or the neighbor's property." Marcus nodded numbly, watching as streams of water from 3 fire trucks fought a losing battle against the inferno. 40 years of his life were disappearing in smoke and ash, every tool his grandfather had passed down, every ribbon his horses had won, every memory that had made this place home. The financial loss would be devastating, but it was the emotional devastation that brought him to his knees in the muddy field. Sarah's arms wrapping around him as they watched their world burn. "Who would do this?" Sarah whispered against his shoulder, her tears warm against his neck. "Who would want to hurt us like this?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, but his gaze shifted to the house next door, where bedroom lights had flickered. In response to the commotion, he could see a figure silhouetted in the upstairs window: Dale Morrison. Watching the destruction with what looked like satisfaction rather than sympathy, the same Dale Morrison who had been feuding with Marcus for the past 6 months over property lines, water rights, and a dozen other petty disputes that had escalated into something uglier with each passing week. The investigation began 3 days later, when the ashes had cooled enough for Fire Marshal Jennifer Rodriguez to sift through the debris with her team of specialists. Marcus stood at the perimeter of the destruction, his heart breaking anew as he surveyed the twisted metal and charred wood that represented decades of careful construction and loving maintenance. "Mr. Chen," Marshal Rodriguez called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had investigated hundreds of fires and learned to read the story. They told in patterns of burn marks and accelerant residue. "I need to speak with you. We've completed our preliminary investigation. and I'm afraid I have to tell you that this fire was deliberately set. We found clear evidence of an accelerant gasoline, most likely poured along the eastern wall of the barn. This wasn't an accident, Mr. Chen. Someone wanted to destroy your property. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable, confirming what he had feared but hoped wasn't true. Someone had deliberately tried to kill his horses, destroy his livelihood, and erase the legacy his grandfather had built with his own hands. The violation felt deeper than theft, more personal than vandalism. It was an attack on everything he held sacred. "Do you have any idea who might want to harm you?" Marshal Rodriguez asked gently. "Any recent disputes with neighbors, business, competitors, former employees?" Marcus's jaw tightened as he looked toward the Morrison house, where Dale was pressure washing his driveway with suspicious enthusiasm for a man who typically let his property maintenance slide for months at a time. "Dale Morrison," he said quietly, "my neighbor. We've had some disagreements lately." "What kind of disagreements?" The story poured out of Marcus in a torrent of frustrated words. How Dale had accused him of letting his horses damage the shared fence line. How Dale had threatened to make him pay when Marcus refused to split the cost of repairs he hadn't caused. How their argument 3 days ago had ended with Dale shouting that Marcus would regret the day he decided to mess with the wrong neighbor. Marshal Rodriguez took careful notes, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "Has Mr. Morrison made any other threats?" Marcus replied, the memory of Dale's red-faced rage still fresh in his mind. "He said I'd learn what it feels like to lose something important." "We'll definitely want to speak with Mr. Morrison," the marshal said, closing her tablet. "In the meantime, I need you to think carefully about anyone else who might have had access to your property or reason to want to harm you. This level of destruction suggests someone with a serious grudge." As Marshal Rodriguez walked away to continue her investigation, Marcus remained standing in the ruins of his barn, his mind racing with questions and suspicions that threatened to consume him like the fire that had taken everything he'd worked for. The insurance money would eventually come, and he could rebuild the structure. But the irreplaceable items, his grandfather's hand-forged tools, the championship ribbons, the photographs documenting decades of horse breeding success, were gone forever. That evening, as Marcus sat on his front porch, watching the sun set over the blackened remains of his barn, Dale Morrison emerged from his house and walked deliberately toward the property line that separated their homes. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed he held all the cards, his thick frame casting a long shadow across the fence that had become the epicenter of their conflict. "Heard you had yourself a little barbecue the other night?" Dale called, out his voice carrying the mock sympathy of someone pretending to care about a tragedy they had caused. "Real shame about that old barn. Good thing your horses made it out alive." Marcus stood slowly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, as he recognized the barely concealed satisfaction in Dale's tone. "Fire marshal says it was arson," he replied evenly, his voice carrying across the evening air with deadly calm. "Says someone poured gasoline and lit it up on purpose." Dale's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught the brief flicker of something fear, perhaps, or a calculation that passed across his neighbor's face before he recovered his composure. "Well, that's terrible," Dale said, his words dripping with false concern. "Can't imagine who would do such a thing to a nice family like yours, can't you?" Marcus asked, taking a step closer to the fence that separated them. "Because I can. Imagine it pretty clearly. I can imagine someone who's been looking for revenge over a petty property dispute, someone who thinks intimidation and destruction are acceptable ways to settle a disagreement." Dale's mask of false sympathy slipped, revealing the malicious satisfaction underneath. "You know what your problem is, Chen? You think you're better than everyone else. You think because you've got your fancy horses and your old family property, you can treat your neighbors like dirt. Well, maybe it's time you learned that actions have consequences." The threat was barely veiled, hanging in the air between them like smoke from the destroyed barn. Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, not just anger, but a sea. Marcus Chen didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring out the window at the smoldering remains of his barn while his mind churned through possibilities like a machine calculating odds. Sarah had finally dozed off on the couch around 4 a.m., exhausted from crying and worrying. But Marcus couldn't quiet the rage that burned in his chest with the same intensity as the fire that had consumed his livelihood. At 6:30 a.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Ray Kowalski from the County Sheriff's Department, a man Marcus had known since they'd played high school football together 25 years ago. "Marcus, I heard about the barn." Ray's voice carried genuine sympathy. Mixed with professional concern, Jennifer Rodriguez asked me to follow up on the arson investigation. "I need to ask you some questions about your neighbor, Dale Morrison." "I'll tell you whatever you need to know," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation and lack of sleep. "But let me guess, you already talked to him and he has an alibi." Ray's pause confirmed Marcus's suspicions before he spoke. "Dale claims he was home all night with his wife. She backs up his story, says they were watching Netflix until midnight, then went straight to bed. No witnesses saw him leave the house. No security cameras caught him on your property. It's going to be tough to make a case stick without more evidence." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd spent enough years dealing with lawyers and insurance companies to know how the system worked, or more accurately, how it failed. People like him, so he burns down my barn, traumatizes my horses, and destroys 40 years of my life, and he walks free because his wife lies for him. "I didn't say he walks free," Ray replied carefully. "I said we need more evidence. We're still processing the scene, looking for fingerprints, DNA, anything that might tie him to the crime. But Marcus, I need you to promise me you won't do anything stupid while we build our case." The warning in Ray's voice was clear, but Marcus had already moved beyond caring about official channels and proper procedures. The system had failed him. Before, when his insurance company had delayed payments after his father's death, when the county had ignored his complaints about Dale's illegal dumping, when the homeowners association had sided with Dale in their fence dispute despite clear evidence of property line violations. "I won't do anything illegal," Marcus said, which was technically true. What he planned to do would be expensive, disruptive, and deeply satisfying, but it wouldn't violate any laws. Sometimes the difference between legal and illegal was just a matter of creative interpretation. After hanging up with Ray, Marcus walked outside to survey his property with fresh eyes. The barn was a total loss, but the destruction had revealed something interesting: the water damage from the fire. Department's efforts had created a muddy mess that extended across his property line onto Dale's meticulously maintained lawn. The same lawn Dale had bragged about to anyone who would listen. The same grass he'd paid a landscaping company $12,000 to install just 6 months ago. But it wasn't the damaged lawn that captured Marcus's attention. It was the sparkling blue swimming pool visible through the gaps in Dale's privacy. Fenced the $20,000 in-ground pool Dale had installed without proper permits, the one he'd used to throw loud parties that violated noise ordinances, the one that represented everything Dale valued about his carefully constructed suburban paradise. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley Construction and Concrete. Tom had built the foundation for Marcus's original horse stable 15 years ago, and they'd maintained a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. More importantly, Tom owed Marcus a favor. Marcus had provided references that helped Tom win a major commercial contract 2 years ago. "Tom, it's Marcus Chen," he said when the call connected. "I need to talk to you about a job, a big one." They met an hour later at Rosie's Diner, a truck stop restaurant where concrete contractors, ranchers, and construction workers gathered for coffee and gossip before starting their day. Tom slid into the booth across from Marcus. His weathered face creased with concern as he studied his friend's haggard appearance. "Heard about the fire," Tom said without preamble. "I'm real sorry, Marcus. That barn was a piece of history. Your grandfather would be heartbroken." "Someone burned it down on purpose," Marcus replied, his voice flat with exhaustion and barely controlled rage. The fire marshal confirmed it was arson. Gasoline poured along the wall and lit up like a Christmas tree. Tom's expression darkened. "You know who did it?" "I know, but proving it in court is going to be nearly impossible. His wife gave him an alibi, and unless we find his fingerprints on a gas can, he's going to walk away laughing while I rebuild my life from scratch." "So what do you want from me?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to the other tables. I want you to help me send a message, a legal message that will make it clear that actions have consequences." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus outlined his plan with the precision of an architect designing a cathedral. Tom listened without interruption, his expression shifting from surprise to admiration to concern as the details unfolded. When Marcus finished, Tom sat back in his booth and shook his head slowly. "Jesus, Marcus, you're talking about a lot of concrete. That's going to cost you a fortune." "I've got the money," Marcus replied. "Insurance will cover the barn eventually, but I've got savings." 40 years of careful financial planning gives a man options when he needs them. "It's not about the money," Tom said carefully. "It's about what happens afterward. Dale Morrison strikes me as the kind of man who doesn't take humiliation well. You do this, and he's going to come after you with everything he's got." Marcus's smile was cold and hard as winter steel. "Let him come. After what he did to my horses, to my grandfather's barn, I welcome the opportunity to finish this conversation face to face." Tom studied his friend's expression for a long moment, recognizing the implacable determination that had helped Marcus build one of the most successful horse breeding operations in Colorado. "When do you want to do this? Tomorrow morning? Early? I want Dale to wake up to the sound of diesel engines and hydraulic pumps. I want him to understand what it feels like to watch something precious being destroyed while he stands helpless to stop it." They spent another hour working out the logistics permits that needed to be pulled, equipment that needed to be reserved, timing that needed to be coordinated with surgical precision. Tom made phone calls to his crew chiefs, explaining that they had a rush job that would pay double overtime but required absolute discretion. By the time they left the diner, 10 concrete trucks were reserved for the following morning, along with pumping equipment and a crew of workers who specialized in large-scale residential projects. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the county planning office to research property records and zoning regulations. What he discovered made his plan even more satisfying. Dale's swimming pool had been installed without proper permits, in violation of setback requirements that mandated a minimum distance from property lines. The pool was technically an illegal structure, which meant Dale had no legal recourse if something happened to it. But Marcus wasn't interested in reporting violations to code enforcement. That would take months to resolve and result in nothing more than a fine Dale could easily afford. What Marcus had in mind would be far more immediate and infinitely more satisfying. He spent the evening at his kitchen table, drawing diagrams and calculating volumes with the precision of an engineer. Sarah found him there at midnight, surrounded by papers covered with measurements and calculations. "What are you planning?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of tea. Marcus looked at his wife of 23 years, seeing the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes since the fire, the way her shoulders carried new tension that hadn't been there a week ago. Sarah had lost as much as he had in the fire: her own memories, her own connection to the horses they'd raised together, her own sense of security in the place they'd called home for over 2 decades. "Justice," he said simply. "Dale Morrison destroyed our life, and the law isn't going to hold him accountable. So I'm going to hold him accountable myself." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that spoke of partnership and shared determination. "What do you need me to do?" The question surprised him. He'd expected her to try to talk him out of his plan, to urge caution and restraint and faith in the legal system. Instead, she was offering to help him execute a scheme that would irrevocably change their relationship with their neighbor and possibly expose them to civil liability. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This isn't going to be subtle." "When Dale wakes up tomorrow morning, he's going to know exactly who did this and why. There's no going back once we start." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. "He burned down your grandfather's barn, Marcus. He could have killed our horses. He threatened our family and our home. And now he's going to get away with it, because—" The first concrete truck rumbled down Maple Street at exactly 6 a.m., its diesel engine growling like a mechanical beast, hungry for destruction. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching as Tom Bradley's convoy of industrial vehicles positioned themselves along the curb with military precision. 10 trucks, each carrying 6 cubic yards of concrete, followed by pumping equipment, generators, and a crew of 8 workers who moved with the efficient purpose of men who understood that time was money and discretion was everything. Dale Morrison's house remained dark and silent, its windows reflecting the gray dawn sky like closed eyes. His prized BMW sat in the driveway, still beaded with dew from the cool Colorado morning, positioned exactly where Dale parked it every night, close enough to his front door to minimize the distance he'd have to walk with his morning coffee. Far enough from the street to avoid scratches from passing delivery trucks, the car represented everything Dale valued: status, control, and the illusion of superiority over his neighbors. Sarah appeared beside Marcus at the window, her hand finding his shoulder as they watched Tom Bradley jump down from the lead truck's cab. Tom moved with the confidence of a man who had poured foundations for shopping centers and office buildings. But Marcus could see the tension in his friend's shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward Dale's house as if expecting confrontation. At any moment. "Last chance to change your mind," Sarah whispered, though her voice carried no suggestion that she wanted him to reconsider. After 23 years of marriage, she knew her husband well enough to recognize the implacable determination that had taken hold of him. The same focus that had helped him build their ranch into a successful operation, despite droughts, economic downturns, and a dozen other challenges that might have broken lesser men. "No," Marcus replied, his voice steady. As granite, Dale made his choice when he lit that match. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The sound of hydraulic systems engaging echoed across the quiet neighborhood as Tom's crew began extending the concrete pumping equipment. The mechanical symphony of diesel engines, hydraulic pumps, and shouted instructions shattered the suburban morning peace like a sledgehammer through glass. Marcus watched as porch lights flickered on in houses up and down the street, early risers drawn to their windows by the unexpected industrial commotion. At 6:15 a.m., Dale Morrison's bedroom light snapped on. Marcus felt a surge of savage satisfaction as he watched his neighbor's silhouette appear at the upstairs window. Arms gesturing frantically as Dale tried to comprehend the scene unfolding in his backyard, the concrete trucks had positioned themselves along the property line, their chutes extended over Dale's fence toward the sparkling blue swimming pool that represented his pride and joy. "What the hell is going on out there?" Dale's voice carried across the morning air as he burst through his back door, still in pajamas and slippers, his face flushed with confusion and mounting rage. He stumbled across his perfectly manicured lawn toward the fence line, where Tom Bradley was consulting a clipboard with the calm professionalism of a man following legitimate work orders. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Tom said pleasantly, not looking up from his paperwork. "Sorry about the early start, but we've got a big job to finish today. County permit number 2847C, authorized by property owner Marcus Chen for concrete work on his land." Dale's face went through a spectrum of colors: confusion, recognition, and finally a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure had spiked into dangerous territory. "You can't do this. That's my pool, my property." Tom finally looked up, his expression the picture of innocent bewilderment. "Your pool." "Sir, according to my surveyor's report, this concrete work is taking place entirely on Mr. Chen's property. You might want to check your property lines." The beauty of Marcus's plan revealed itself in that moment. The survey he'd commissioned 3 days ago had confirmed what he'd suspected. Dale's precious swimming pool extended 18 inches onto Marcus's property, a violation of easement agreements that Dale had ignored for 2 years despite repeated complaints. What Marcus was about to do wasn't vandalism or destruction of property, it was concrete work on his own land that would happen to make Dale's illegal pool completely unusable. "This is insane," Dale screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he watched the first concrete truck position its chute directly over his pool's deep end. "You can't fill in my pool. I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested." "Actually, I can," Marcus said, stepping out of his house with the calm confidence of a man who had spent 3 days consulting with lawyers and county officials. "Your pool extends onto my property without permission. I'm simply exercising my right to pour concrete on my own land. What happens to your pool is an unfortunate side effect of your illegal construction." The confrontation Marcus had been anticipating finally arrived as Dale charged toward the fence, separating their properties. His face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You son of a bitch, this is about the barn, isn't it? You think I burned down your goddamn barn?" "I don't think anything," Marcus replied evenly. I know you burned down my barn. I know you traumatized my horses and destroyed 40 years of my family's history. And now you know what it feels like to watch something precious being destroyed while you stand helpless to stop it." Dale's hands clenched into fists as he pressed against the fence, his knuckles white with rage. "Prove it. You can't prove I had anything to do with your barn." "I don't have to prove it," Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect legal loophole for revenge. "The beauty of justice is that it doesn't always require a courtroom. Sometimes it just requires concrete." The first load of cement began flowing at 6:30 a.m., a gray river of liquid stone that poured into Dale's pool with the inexorable certainty of destiny. The sound was deeply satisfying, a wet, heavy sloshing that spoke of permanence and finality. Dale stood at the fence screaming threats and obscenities, but his words were lost in the mechanical symphony of diesel engines and hydraulic pumps. Marcus watched his neighbor's face as 6 cubic yards of concrete transformed the pristine blue swimming pool into a gray monument to consequences. The rage in Dale's eyes gradually gave way to something else, a dawning recognition that his carefully constructed suburban paradise was being systematically destroyed by a man who had been pushed too far. "You crazy bastard," Dale shouted over the noise of the concrete pumps. "Do you have any idea how much that pool cost me? $20,000. $20,000 you're destroying." "About half what my barn was worth," Marcus replied without emotion. "And my barn had sentimental value your pool will never have. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands in 1938. Your pool was installed by contractors you probably paid minimum wage." The second truck moved into position as the first finished its load, and Dale's voice rose to a pitch that suggested complete psychological breakdown. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyer. You can't do this to me. Go ahead," Marcus said, pulling out his phone and checking the time. "While you're making calls, I'll be here watching 60 cubic yards of concrete solve a property dispute that's been going on for 6 months. Dale stumbled back toward his house, his slippers soaked with dew from his ruined lawn, his pajamas stained with sweat despite the cool morning air. Marcus could see him through the kitchen window, gesticulating wildly as he spoke into his phone, probably calling everyone from the sheriff's department to his insurance company to his lawyer. But Marcus had done his homework. The permits were legitimate, the survey was accurate, and the concrete work was taking place entirely on his own property. Dale's pool might be collateral damage, but it was legal collateral damage executed with surgical precision and ironclad documentation. 7 a.m., a small crowd had gathered along Maple Street to witness the spectacle. Neighbors emerged from their houses with coffee cups and smartphones, recording the systematic destruction of Dale Morrison's prized swimming pool, while whispering among themselves about the mysterious concrete operation that had transformed their quiet suburban morning into theater of the absurd. Marcus recognized most of the faces. The Johnsons from 3 houses down, elderly Mrs. Patterson who walked her dog past his property every morning, the young couple with twin babies who had moved in 6 months ago. These were people who had watched Dale's increasingly erratic behavior over the past year, who had heard his loud parties and seen his intimidation tactics, who knew exactly what kind of neighbor he had become. "Serves him right," Mrs. Patterson said loudly enough for Dale to hear as he stood at his fence, screaming into his phone. "That man has been nothing but trouble since he moved in. Loud music, illegal construction, threatening decent people. I hope they fill that pool all the way to the top." The third concrete truck began its pour as Dale's wife emerged from the house, her face pale with shock as she surveyed the destruction taking place in their backyard. Linda Morrison was a quiet woman who had always seemed embarrassed by her husband's confrontational behavior, and Marcus felt a brief pang of sympathy for her until he remembered that she had provided Dale's alibi for the night of the fire. "Dale, what's happening?" Linda asked, her voice barely audible over the industrial noise. The concrete had been hardening for 3 hours when Dale Morrison made his first mistake. At 11:30 a.m., while Marcus sat on his porch drinking coffee and admiring the gray monument that had replaced his neighbor's swimming pool, Dale emerged from his house carrying a sledgehammer and a face full of murderous intent. "I'll show you what happens when you mess with my property." Dale screamed across the fence line, his voice cracking with hysteria as he raised the heavy tool above his head. "I'll break up every goddamn inch of this concrete." Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, watching as Dale swung the sledgehammer at the hardening cement with the fury of a man who had finally snapped. The impact sent jarring vibrations up Dale's arms, but left only a small chip in the surface. Concrete, mixed with industrial-grade hardening agents, wasn't something that could be destroyed with hand tools and rage. "You might want to think about that," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man explaining basic physics to a child. "That concrete extends 18 inches onto my property. Every swing of that hammer is destruction of my property, which makes it a felony." Dale's response was to swing harder, his face purple with exertion as he tried to demolish 60 cubic yards of hardened cement with nothing but determination and a 20-pound sledgehammer. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool autumn air, and his breathing became labored as he realized the futility of his assault on the concrete monument. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording, knowing that Dale's breakdown would provide excellent evidence for the inevitable legal proceedings. "That's good," he said encouragingly. "Make sure you get the part that's clearly on my side of the property line. My security cameras are getting great footage." The mention of security cameras stopped Dale mid-swing. He looked around frantically, spotting the discrete cameras Marcus had installed along his property line 3 days ago. Another preparation that would prove crucial in the coming legal battle. The cameras had been recording everything since 6 a.m., capturing Dale's threats, his wife's damaging questions, and now his felonious destruction of property. "You son of a bitch," Dale panted, leaning on the sledgehammer handle as exhaustion overwhelmed his rage. "You planned this whole thing. The cameras, the permits, the survey. You've been planning this for days." "I've been planning this since the night you burned down my barn," Marcus replied evenly. "The only difference is my revenge is legal." Dale's second mistake came 20 minutes later when Sheriff's Deputy Lisa Martinez arrived in response to Dale's frantic phone calls. Instead of calmly explaining his position, Dale launched into a screaming tirade about property rights, insurance fraud, and conspiracy theories that made him sound like a man teetering on the edge of complete mental breakdown. "He destroyed my pool," Dale shouted, gesturing wildly at the concrete expanse that had replaced his backyard oasis. $20,000 worth of property. This is criminal destruction, harassment, assault." Deputy Martinez, a 15-year veteran who had seen every variety of neighbor dispute imaginable, listened patiently while reviewing the permits and survey documents Marcus provided. Her expression remained professionally neutral. But Marcus caught the slight eye roll when Dale's voice reached a particularly hysterical pitch. "Mr. Morrison," she said when Dale finally paused for breath, "Mr. Chen has legal permits for concrete work on his property. Your pool appears to be built on his land without permission. If anyone has a legal complaint here, it's Mr. Chen against you for illegal construction." "That's impossible," Dale screamed. "I had a survey done when I built that pool. It's entirely on my property. Do you have documentation of that survey?" Deputy Martinez asked. The silence that followed was deafening. Dale's face went through several color changes as he realized he had no documentation to support his claim, because he had never commissioned a survey, assuming that his rough estimate of property boundaries was sufficient for a swimming pool installation. Marcus, meanwhile, handed Deputy Martinez a thick folder containing the original property deed. 3 separate surveys conducted over the past decade, and detailed measurements showing exactly how far Dale's pool extended onto his land. "I've been documenting this property line dispute for 2 years," he said. "Mr. Morrison has ignored multiple requests to remove the illegal construction." Dale's third mistake was pulling out his phone and calling his lawyer while Deputy Martinez was still taking statements. Marcus could hear every word of the conversation as Dale screamed into the device about emergency injunctions, property destruction, and criminal charges. He wanted filed immediately. "What do you mean, there's nothing you can do?" Dale shouted into the phone. "He destroyed my pool. $20,000. Sue him. Arrest him. Do something." The lawyer's response was apparently not what Dale wanted to hear, because he ended the call by throwing his phone against his house with enough force to shatter the screen. The display of uncontrolled rage in front of a law enforcement officer was noted in Deputy Martinez's report, along with Dale's earlier threats and property destruction. "Mr. Morrison," Deputy Martinez said carefully, "I'm going to strongly recommend that you go inside and calm down. Your behavior is becoming concerning, and if you continue making threats or destroying property, I'll have to consider other options." The warning should have been enough, but Dale Morrison was a man who had built his identity around intimidation and control. The sight of his destroyed pool, combined with his dawning realization that Marcus had outmaneuvered him completely, triggered something primal and dangerous. "Other options." Dale laughed bitterly. "You want to know about other options? I'll show you other options." He stormed into his house, returning moments later with a red gasoline can, the same type of container the fire marshal had identified as the probable source of accelerant used in the barn fire. The symbolism was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his blood turn cold as he realized his neighbor was about to cross a line from property destruction into direct threats of violence. "You burned down my pool!" Dale screamed, holding the gas can above his head like a trophy. "Now, I'm going to burn down your house. See how you like it when something you care about goes up in flames." Deputy Martinez's hand moved to her service weapon as she stepped between Dale and the property line. Mr. Morrison put down the gas can and stepped back from the fence. "You're making terroristic threats, and I will not hesitate to use force if necessary." But Dale was beyond reason, threats, beyond any consideration of consequences. He unscrewed the cap of the gas can and began splashing gasoline across his own yard, creating a trail of accelerant that led toward the fence separating his property from Marcus's house. "40 years you've lived here," Dale ranted as he poured gasoline with the methodical precision of a man who had done this before. 40 years of acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, let's see how superior you feel when you're standing in the ashes of everything you've built." The confirmation Marcus had been waiting for came in that moment of uncontrolled rage. Dale's expertise with gasoline, his casual familiarity with arson techniques, and his obvious experience creating accelerant trails provided the missing link between suspicion and proof. The fire marshal had been right. This wasn't Dale's first time burning down a neighbor's property. "Are you recording this?" Marcus asked Deputy Martinez quietly. "Body camera's been running since I arrived," she replied, her voice tight with tension as she watched Dale pour gasoline in an increasingly erratic pattern. "Mr. Morrison, this is your final warning. Put down the gas can and step away from the accelerant." Dale's response was to pull a lighter from his pocket. What happened next unfolded with the slow-motion clarity of a nightmare. Dale flicked the lighter, its small flame dancing in the autumn air like a malevolent spirit seeking destruction. Deputy Martinez drew her weapon, her voice cutting through the morning air with the authority of someone trained to stop threats. Before they became tragedies, drop the lighter, drop it now. But Dale Morrison was a man who had spent his entire life believing that intimidation and threats would eventually force the world to bend to his will. He had never encountered someone who refused to be intimidated, never faced consequences that couldn't be avoided with lies and alibis, never met a problem that couldn't be solved with destruction and violence. The lighter fell toward the gasoline ground in a lazy arc that seemed to take forever. Marcus watched it fall, knowing that in seconds his house, the house where he had lived for 23 years, where he had raised his daughter, where he and Sarah had built their life together, would be consumed by the same flames that had taken his barn. But sometimes justice arrives in unexpected forms. The lighter hit the wet grass and immediately went out, extinguished by the morning dew that Dale had ignored in his rage. The gasoline sat harmlessly on the ground, its fumes rising in the cool air but failing to ignite without a sustained flame source. Dale stood frozen, staring at the failed lighter with the expression of a man who had just watched his final gambit collapse into absurdity. Deputy Martinez tackled him before he could try again, her training taking over as she secured the man who had just attempted arson in front of a law enforcement officer. "Dale Morrison, you're under. Part 5. The Escalation 3 weeks later. Marcus Chen was feeding his horses when he noticed the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of hay and leather that normally filled his rebuilt barn. This was something chemical, acrid, like burned plastic. Mixed with automotive fluid, he followed the odor around the corner of the new structure and found its source. Someone had poured motor oil. mixed with antifreeze across the foundation of his barn, and set it smoldering with road flares. The fire hadn't caught, the concrete foundation wasn't flammable. And the autumn rain had dampened everything enough to prevent serious ignition. But the message was clear. Dale Morrison might be sitting in county jail, awaiting trial on arson charges. But he still had friends willing to continue his war. Marcus pulled out his phone and photographed the evidence. Then called Detective Ray. Kowalski, while he waited for the police to arrive, he walked the perimeter of his property, checking for other signs of sabotage. What he found made his blood run cold. Someone had cut the fence line in 3 places, creating gaps large enough for his horses to escape onto the county road where morning traffic moved at 50 miles per hour. Thunder, his prized stallion, stood near one of the gaps, sniffing curiously at the severed wire that could have meant his death if Marcus hadn't discovered it first, but it was the note tied to the fence post that confirmed Marcus's suspicions about who was behind the escalating attacks. Written in block letters on a piece of torn cardboard, the message was simple and direct. Concrete won't save you. Detective Kowalski arrived 20 minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the attempted arson and fence sabotage. "Dale's been in lockup for 3 weeks, he said, photographing the evidence with the methodical precision of a man who had investigated dozens of similar cases. But his brother Rick got out of Kagan City last month. 3-year stretch for assault and battery. Marcus had heard about Rick Morrison but had never met him. Dale's older brother, who had moved to Colorado 2 years ago after serving time in Wyoming for aggravated assault, where Dale was a suburban bully who preferred intimidation to violence. Rick was the genuine article, a career criminal with a history of escalating revenge against anyone who crossed his family. "What's the plan?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "We arrest Rick, he makes bail, and 6 hours later, he's back here with a different approach," Ray replied honestly. "Unless we catch him in the act, it's going to be tough. To make charges stick, Dale's not talking. His lawyer has him locked down tight in Rick's, smart enough to avoid our surveillance." Marcus nodded, understanding the limitations of law enforcement when dealing with determined criminals who had learned to work within the system's constraints. The legal process that had protected him during his concrete revenge was now protecting the Morrison brothers as they escalated their attacks from property destruction to potentially lethal sabotage. That evening, Marcus sat in his kitchen reviewing security footage from the cameras he had installed around his property. The sabotage had occurred during a narrow window between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., when a figure in dark clothing had moved with the practiced efficiency of someone familiar with rural property layout. The person's face was never visible, but their movements suggested military or law enforcement training, the kind of tactical awareness that came from institutional education in violence. Sarah found him at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by printed photographs and legal documents, planning their next move with the same methodical precision he had used for the concrete operation. "It's not going to end, is it?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of tea. "Even if Dale goes to prison, his brother is going to keep coming after us." "No," Marcus agreed. "Men like Rick Morrison don't stop until they're stopped. The question is whether we wait for him to escalate to violence against us personally, or whether we take proactive measures." Sarah studied her husband's face, seeing the cold calculation that had replaced his earlier rage. The fire had made Marcus angry. The concrete revenge had satisfied his need for justice. But the ongoing attacks had transformed him into something harder and more dangerous than either of them had expected. "What kind of proactive measures?" she asked. Marcus spread out a series of photographs on the table images he had taken during his investigation of Rick Morrison's background. The older Morrison brother had been busy since his release from prison, establishing himself in a rented house 15 miles away and apparently using it as a base for drug distribution and stolen goods fencing. The property was isolated poorly, maintained, and according to county records, completely uninsured. "Rick Morrison has been using his house to store stolen motorcycles," Marcus explained, pointing to photographs that showed expensive Harley-Davidsons in various stages of disassembly. Detective Kowalski confirmed it during his investigation, but they can't get a search warrant without more evidence. However, sometimes evidence creates itself. The plan Marcus outlined was more complex than his concrete revenge, involving careful timing, strategic anonymity, and a deep understanding of how criminals like Rick Morrison operated. It would require patience, precision, and a willingness to operate in the gray areas between legal and illegal that characterized warfare between neighbors who had moved beyond the constraints of civil society. "This is dangerous," Sarah said when Marcus finished explaining his plan. "If Rick figures out we're responsible, he won't settle for burning down buildings. He'll come after us directly." "He's already coming after us directly," Marcus replied, showing her the photographs of the cut fence lines. Those gaps were positioned to channel our horses onto the highway during morning rush hour. Rick Morrison isn't interested in property damage. He's trying to kill our animals as a prelude to killing us. The truth of that statement settled between them like concrete hardening in a swimming pool. The war between neighbors had escalated beyond revenge into something approaching assassination, and the law enforcement system that should have protected them was hamstrung by constitutional protections that benefited criminals more than victims. 3 days later, Marcus put his plan into motion. It began with an anonymous tip to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation about suspicious motorcycle activity. At Rick Morrison's address, the tip was carefully crafted to sound like it came from a rival drug dealer rather than a vengeful neighbor. Complete with details about Rick's prison connections and his brother's legal troubles, the second phase involved Marcus's cousin Eddie, who worked as a mechanic in Denver and had connections throughout the state's motorcycle community. Eddie made discreet inquiries about stolen bikes, focusing on the specific models Marcus had photographed at Rick's property. Within 48 hours, he had identified 3 motorcycles that had been reported stolen from dealers in Fort Collins and Colorado Springs. The third phase was the most dangerous. Marcus waited until Rick Morrison left his property for what appeared to be a regular supply run, then approached the isolated house with tools and equipment that would leave no fingerprints or DNA evidence. He wasn't there to steal anything or cause immediate damage. He was there to plant the seeds of Rick Morrison's destruction. The beauty of Marcus's plan lay in its simplicity. Instead of attacking Rick directly, he would make Rick's criminal activities visible to law enforcement in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The stolen motorcycles were already there. Marcus simply had to ensure they were discovered by authorities who would be obligated to investigate. Working quickly, Marcus attached small GPS tracking devices to each stolen motorcycle, devices that would be discovered during the inevitable police investigation and traced back to their theft victims. He also installed a motion-activated camera in the barn where Rick stored his illegal inventory, positioned to capture anyone who entered or left the building. The final element was a carefully orchestrated confrontation designed to make Rick Morrison's violence visible to law enforcement. Marcus arranged for Detective Kowalski to be in the area when Rick returned from his supply run, ostensibly investigating reports of suspicious activity. The timing was crucial. Rick would arrive to find his property under surveillance, triggering the kind of aggressive response that would justify immediate arrest. Everything went according to plan until Rick Morrison proved to be smarter and more dangerous than Marcus had anticipated. Instead of confronting the detective directly, Rick spotted the surveillance and immediately suspected a setup. Rather than panicking or trying to destroy evidence, he calmly loaded the stolen motorcycles into a truck and drove them to Marcus's property, where he unloaded them in the middle of the night and called in an anonymous tip about suspicious activity. At the Chen Ranch, Marcus woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of search warrants being executed and drug enforcement agents tearing through his property looking for evidence of motorcycle theft. The GPS tracking devices he had planted now implicated him as the thief, and the motion-activated camera Rick had discovered provided evidence that Marcus had been on Rick's property without permission. By 7 a.m., Marcus Chen was sitting in the same jail cell that had held Dale Morrison 3 weeks earlier, charged with burglary, theft, and conspiracy to distribute stolen goods. The concrete monument in Dale's backyard had been his victory. Marcus Chen spent 42 hours in county lockup before his lawyer, Patricia Wells, managed to secure his release on bail. 42 hours of sleeping on a concrete bunk, eating food that tasted like cardboard, and listening to Rick Morrison's friends brag about how they had set up the rich horse guy who thought he could mess with the wrong family. The stolen motorcycles had been planted with surgical precision. Rick Morrison hadn't just dumped them on Marcus's property. He had hidden them in Marcus's own barn, covered them with Marcus's own tarps, and even planted registration documents with Marcus's fingerprints on them. The GPS tracking devices Marcus had installed became evidence of his guilt rather than Rick's. And the motion-activated camera footage showed Marcus clearly committing burglary at Rick's property. "They're offering a plea deal," Patricia said as they walked out of the courthouse into the pale November sunlight. "Guilty to criminal trespass and receiving stolen property. 18 months, supervised probation, $5,000 fine, and restitution for the motorcycles. And if I don't take it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from Patricia's expression. 7 years in state prison if they can make the conspiracy charges stick. Rick Morrison is claiming you were the mastermind behind a motorcycle theft ring, and Dale is backing up his brother's story from jail. They're painting you as a wealthy rancher who thought he could buy his way out of consequences. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the town where he had lived his entire life, and felt the weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The Morrison brothers had outmaneuvered him completely, turning his attempt at justice into evidence of his own criminality. Worse, they had done it with a kind of criminal sophistication that suggested years of experience manipulating the legal system. "There's something else," Patricia said carefully. "The prosecution is also offering to drop all charges against Dale Morrison if you take the plea deal. They're claiming his arson was a response to your harassment, and that Rick's actions were justified retaliation for your burglary." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not only would he go to prison for crimes he hadn't committed, but the man who had burned down his barn would walk free. Dale Morrison would return to his concrete-filled pool and his suburban house, vindicated by a legal system that had twisted victim into perpetrator with bureaucratic efficiency. That night, Marcus sat in his kitchen, staring at the plea agreement, while Sarah read over his shoulder. The document was a masterpiece of legal language that transformed 18 months of supervised probation into a lifetime of criminal record. The felony conviction would follow him forever, affecting his ability to own firearms, obtain business licenses, or maintain the federal permits required for his horse breeding operation. "We could fight it," Sarah said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Get a better lawyer, hire private investigators, prove that Rick planted the evidence. With what money?" Marcus replied, "The barn fire already wiped out our savings, and legal fees for a case like this would cost more than we have. Patricia is good, but she's not a miracle worker." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the security monitors that showed their property perimeter. The cameras Marcus had installed to protect himself from the Morrison brothers now served as constant reminders of how completely his life had been upended by men who understood that the legal system rewarded cunning more than justice. The breakthrough came at 11:30 p.m. when Marcus's phone rang. Detective Ray Kowalski's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded attention. "Marcus, I need you to get down to the station. Now don't bring your lawyer. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't discuss this call with anyone." "What's happened?" Marcus asked, but the line had already gone dead. Marcus drove to the sheriff's station through empty streets, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from additional charges to news of Sarah's arrest. The building was mostly dark except for the detective division, where Ray waited with an expression that mixed professional excitement with personal satisfaction. "Rick Morrison made a mistake," Ray said without preamble, leading Marcus to an interview room where a video monitor displayed frozen security footage. "A big one. He got drunk last night and decided to brag to the wrong person about how he set you up." The video began playing, showing Rick Morrison in a bar Marcus didn't recognize, gesticulating wildly as he told his story to a woman with short blonde hair. The audio was clear enough to capture every incriminating detail, as Rick described planting the motorcycles, forging the documents, and manipulating the evidence to frame Marcus for crimes Rick had actually committed. "Who's the woman?" Marcus asked Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent Jennifer Nash, working undercover on a motorcycle theft investigation. Rick had no idea he was confessing to a federal agent with recording equipment. Ray's smile was the first genuinely good news Marcus had received in weeks. Agent Nash has been tracking stolen motorcycles across 3 states, and Rick just handed her a complete confession to crimes we didn't even know he had committed. The recording continued as Rick detailed his criminal activities with the pride of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone. He described stealing motorcycles from dealerships in Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. He explained how he had used his brother's legal troubles as cover for his own criminal enterprise. Most importantly, he provided detailed descriptions of how he had framed Marcus, including specific information about evidence placement that only the actual perpetrator could have known. "There's more," Ray said, fast-forwarding to another section of the recording. "Rick also confessed to helping Dale burn down your barn. Apparently, Dale was supposed to make it look like an electrical fire, but he panicked and used too much accelerant." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not the rage that had driven him to pour concrete in Dale's pool, but a cold satisfaction that justice was finally aligning with truth. The Morrison brothers had been so confident in their manipulation of the legal system that they had forgotten the first rule of criminal success: never confess to federal agents in bars. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Federal charges against Rick for interstate transportation of stolen vehicles, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. State charges against both Morrison brothers for arson, fraud, and perjury. Your charges get dropped with prejudice, meaning they can never be Ray leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of a cop who had seen justice served after weeks of frustration. "Oh, and there's a civil forfeiture case against Rick's property. Turns out that house was purchased with proceeds from stolen motorcycle sales. Rick Morrison, at his rented house 15 miles away, the news footage showed agents loading stolen motorcycles into transport trucks while Rick was led away in handcuffs, his face displaying the shocked expression of a criminal who had finally encountered consequences he couldn't manipulate or avoid. Dale Morrison's arrest came 2 hours later, captured by the same security cameras that had recorded his original threats against Marcus, the man who had burned down Marcus's barn and tried to frame him for motorcycle theft. Was led away from his concrete-filled pool in handcuffs. His suburban paradise finally transformed into the prison it had always represented. Sarah found Marcus on the front porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and red above the rebuilt barn that stood as a monument to his family's resilience. The horses grazed peacefully in the pasture, no longer threatened by cut fences or psychopathic neighbors, their calm presence a reminder that some things could be rebuilt after destruction. "It's over," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "No," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the hard wisdom of a man who had learned that justice and law were not always the same thing. "It's finished. There's a difference." The concrete monument in Dale Morrison's backyard would remain as a permanent reminder of their conflict, but it no longer represented revenge. Instead, it had become something else, a testament to the idea that actions truly did have consequences, even when those consequences took months to arrive and came through channels no one had anticipated. Marcus had learned that justice sometimes required patience more than anger, that the legal system could be both weapon and shield depending on who wielded it more skillfully, and that the most satisfying victories were often the ones where your enemies destroyed themselves through their own arrogance and stupidity. The Morrison brothers would spend the next 7 to 10 years in federal prison, their criminal enterprise dismantled by their own need to brag about their cleverness. Their property would be seized, their assets forfeited, and their futures permanently damaged by felony convictions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But more importantly, Marcus Chen had discovered something about himself during the months of conflict that had transformed him from victim to survivor to something harder and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He had learned that when the system failed, a man could create his own justice not through vigilante violence, but through patience, planning, and a kind of methodical